I want to welcome you to the webinar. This session is one that we like to put on for our community of interest in leadership and leadership development. Coming to you from Philly, mainly because I've been taking up temporary residence here at my mother's house. She was hospitalized, I guess about 2.5, 3 months ago. And I'm trying to bring her back to a level of functionality that she's accustomed to. And so I'm here in Philly with her. But I want to thank all of them. I'm sure there are folks on the Zoom who were aware of that and have been sending me well wishes, and to my AFIA family, African American Federal Executive Association. The care package from you was wonderful. To my AU family, I want to thank them for all of their well wishes and the technical support on this call. Lamont, Bree, and Jennifer have been wonderful. They supported me in the first Wednesday webinar that I did, and they're with me on this one. And when I'm with them, I'm in very good hands. I appreciate the smooth jazz, soothing music on the front end. It's my personal favorite music form, so it always gets me to a good place. But I really do need them because I'm a true baby boomer, and technology doesn't come natural to me at this stage. To my federal government family and those who are committed to public service, whether you're in federal service or in the private sector supporting federal service, I want you to know that I very much appreciate what you do. And it's probably the main reason for my enthusiasm in not only doing Wednesday webinars, but this particular one has been kind of in my head for a few months, and I felt this was a good opportunity to engage it. All right, so again, welcome. This is the Wednesday webinar series. I am an executive in residence at American University Key Executive Leadership Program, and I'm in the School of Public Affairs. I've been here for going on my 3rd year after serving in federal service for federal service, state and local government for close to 40 years. The topic this morning is, are you a character-driven leader, or are you a character in a leadership role? The choice is yours. I put this slide in because I want to sort of level set. So if you can identify with any of what I have in that slide, then you're in the right place this morning, and I certainly enjoy having you as part of this webinar. What I experienced before I left federal service, and probably experienced it throughout my entire public sector career, was being expected to do more with less. When I entered public service over 40 years ago, that was a prevailing theme and sentiment for whatever legislative bodies I was working for, and it continues to be so today. As leaders, we're expected to basically bring meaning to the work that we do, and certainly interpret the meaning for the people we serve. And it's very often in this VUCA world that we operate in, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, that meaning making can be very difficult. And sometimes it feels like we're making sense out of nonsense. Being asked to make most of a bad or near impossible situation and circumstance is something I think everybody probably on this call can relate to. And we're all dealing with stimulus overload, whether you're in government or even the private sector. And in government, you're expected to triage all of the things that are presented to you as priorities. And very often you're left out there on a limb figuring out which one you're going to get to first. And then when you have to make a decision, you are expected to make the best decision. But of course, there's usually a variety of decisions that you could choose from. And then managing morale and employee engagement. The FEBS has certainly, I think, for those who have been in leadership positions, has been one of those challenges. I know as the Chief Human Capital Officer for the Social Security Administration for the 15 years that I served in that capacity, we paid a lot of attention to FEBS, and it was a challenge, trying to make sure that employees were having their voices heard and that we were being responsive and that they were engaged as a result of our efforts to hear them and respond to them. And it wasn't simply a demotivational kind of experience. And then all of us, I think, have probably at one time or another wondered, is what we're being asked to do legal, ethical, and moral? And, there's a sort of a mantra I've heard from executives over the years, if it isn't illegal, immoral, or unethical, then I'm expected to do it. And for those who serve as careerists, it doesn't matter who's in that Oval Office. We are there to serve, and we do the best we can with what we are given to work with. So the rhetorical question I've already shared, and let's get into it. So I'm coming at it, and I always love this quote from William Shakespeare, but I'm coming at it from a dramaturgical perspective. I'm a recovering psychologist, got my degree at Temple University in social psychology, social and organizational psych, and always think in terms of the roles that we play. And so this quote by Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, is one that resonates with me deeply. We enter and exit, and quite frankly, it's quite appropriate for federal service, which I tend to look at as this continuous, marathon race with very talented people coming to the work, being handed off to by those who served before them. And so we have a responsibility to not drop the baton. We have a responsibility to take the baton cleanly and run with it with integrity. So here is a quote from Warren Bennis about successful leadership. It's not about being tough or soft, sensitive or assertive. But the first and foremost attribute that we should be bringing to this is character. And of course, he's alluding to good character, because it is possible to bring something other than good character. Here's a quote from General Norman Schwarzkopf. And his point is that the main ingredient of good leadership is good character. And I would certainly amen that. And then we're all probably very sensitive to this iconic quote from Dr. Martin Luther King about his 4 little children. And here he talks about the content of their character, which I think is a real important thing to always remember. That character, it's sometimes very difficult to define, and different people have defined it differently in the literature, but it does come down to attributes, behaviors, actions. And so this quote from Dr. King, I think, is also very appropriate. So in order to tie it in with that point, this is a slide I actually have used in other presentations, and so that's why it's kind of set up the way it is. But if you notice that I highlighted the left side of it, and this is work by Seligman and Peterson on character strengths. They have a tremendous body of literature. This is considered the seminal work in this area. And as you can see on the left side of this particular slide, and you'll see it on the next one, these are the kinds of strengths that people with good character bring to the table. You'll notice the first one being self-control, and I'll be saying more about that later, but things like humility, the ability to forgive, fairness, teamwork, love of learning, being intellectually curious is very, very important. And on this next slide, top item, I think, has become even more important to us as we have moved more and more into a VUCA world. When things are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, it requires leading in an environment like that requires a fair amount of courage, a fair amount of And so when I put this together, I wanted that at the top of the list just to emphasize that point. But it also, as you'll see, going down the list, perseverance, integrity, enthusiasm, love. One of the things that I say very often at the top of any presentation I do with folks about public service or to people who are engaged in public service is that I love public service and I love public servants. And in a way, it's perhaps fitting that I'm doing this broadcast from my mother's house, because my mother is probably has been the most influential in my life with setting the tone for my being in public service. I never intended to go into public service, but she spent her entire career at the Internal Revenue Service, did 45 years there before her retirement, and now at 92, still takes great pride in the work she did there. And as she'll point out to you, she was not on the collection side of the agency. She was on the service side of the agency. So, she felt very, 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 very proud of that. And hearing those stories at the, Saturday breakfast table or at the dinner table about the importance of public service and the difference we can make if we do it well is something that has stayed with me my entire career. So this quote from Susan Biro was in Forbes Community Voice, and I'll just read it because it's a very important one, I think. We call ourselves human beings, but I think that title is aspirational. One we are meant to earn. Being human should mean we are capable of higher level thought and can choose rationally how we respond to external events, as well as to internal thoughts and emotions. We often behave in ways that are extremely ineffective and quite beneath us. We each have so much more power than we give ourselves credit for. And I think that slide really does typify my aspiration for all of us. One way to think of this presentation, it's kind of a Michael Jackson man in the mirror kind of thing. I mean, this is really about looking in the mirror and asking ourselves that question, are we character driven or are we characters playing this role as leader? One of the things that grabbed my attention earlier this year is this article that was in Atlantic magazine, what it means to be a man. Boys need a better answer than the one we're giving them today. And this quote from Peggy Ornstein, who wrote the article, the definition of masculinity seems to be contracting. When asked what traits society values most in boys, only 2% of male survey respondents said honesty and morality. That's troubling to me. And I first used this quote and had a discussion with my class, my graduate class at American U around diversity and inclusion, and particularly around sexism. We were getting into a discussion about how women are treated in the workplace. And of course, it also applies to other groups that tend to not be treated because of this particular trend, which I think is sort of taking character in the exact wrong direction. And so this whole concern about how we are developing and relating to other people with our character is real important. This is a quote from a passage from J. Patrick Doble's Public Integrity work. And I won't read it, but the point here is that some great evils have happened because it comes down to individuals. We may have government agencies that play important roles in people's lives, and sometimes government can present itself as almost amorphous, but it really does come down to us. It comes down to individual leaders and the people who choose to follow them and fulfill the obligations of public service. This is a more direct reference to that administrative evil that can sometimes happen. And if you look at the literature in this area, it'll often cite things like the Jewish Holocaust in Germany during World War II. But you can also apply this to chattel slavery in the U.S. That recent quote by one of our lawmakers that slavery was a necessary evil really does bring home how misguided the thinking can be sometimes in a society. And to think of it that way is problematic, obviously. So what is character? On its face, character is a pretty morally neutral term. Every person is said to have a character, whether it's a good one or a bad one. And we use the term character to describe the most prominent attributes that people tend to bring. Sort of the sum total of their traits. It's about how we think of their nature as people. So character is the core of a person, who we are when we are not under surveillance and no one can see us. We consider someone we perceive to be of good character as worthy of trust and admiration. And so right then and there, it really does beg the question, if you are going to be in an influential position, whether you are a super SME, or a leader, people are watching you, people are taking their example from you. And it is important that you be of good character if you're going to be in the public sector in particular, although I would hope that people in the private sector want to be just as responsible when it comes to integrity. So some examples of good character and bad characters, I would offer you at the bottom, with the bottom bullet, a list of names, and I'm sure there could be a fair amount of consensus among us on these particular individuals and whether we saw them as being people representative or indicative of good character or bad character. Nelson Mandela, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Mahatma Gandhi, George Washington, Idi Amin, Marcus Aurelius, Siddhartha Gautama, or the Buddha, James Marion Sims. James Marion Sims, for example, was touted and coveted to be the father of gynecology in the U.S., but his statue was removed from a park in New York City because when you look at his body of work, while he may have contributed to the scientific community's knowledge in that particular area of medicine, how he went about it was, if you read books like Medical Apartheid, it was heinous. My reading of his work left me feeling he was a sadist. So this whole issue of character is a complex one. Gandhi was, I love his quote, you got to be the change you wish to see in the world, but he was prejudiced towards sub-Saharan Africans. And so the whole notion of character has to be drilled down on when we think about people as being of good character. Adolf Hitler, I think there would be a universal view that he was a monster, but then I'm sure he was kind and gentle to somebody, and they probably looked up to him as a wonderful person. So it requires doing a lot of work, obviously. And so let's get into it. What is character? Here's a quote from Fred Keel, who did a 7-year study of CEOs, their executive staff, and their employees. We define character in the same way that most people assess others' character, by their behavior. And so, people can talk a good game. People can tell you they are of high caliber, of high integrity. But what's their behavior? What kinds of things do they do to demonstrate that they are in fact of good character, of high integrity? You can measure behavior. You can hold people accountable for their actions. And so if they're telling you they're of high caliber, but you don't see the evidence of it, then you probably should question whether their characterization of their character is in fact valid and legitimate. This particular quote from David Brooks, The Road to Character, is an interesting one because, as he says, most of us have clearer strategies for how to acquire character success than we do for how to develop a profound character. The point being here is that, he talks about people having resume virtues, what you are going to display when you're applying for a position or people are doing a showcase of you. You probably put more effort into that, what your executive core qualifications are going to reflect. then perhaps what your eulogy is going to say at the end of your days, as you transition, what will people have the ability to say about you? And so to me, it really does come down to going beyond what people get to see in our workplace. It gets into something much, much deeper. And what do we mean by being character driven? So it gets us into the whole area of ethics and morals and the principles that we operate from as it relates to our behaviors, and our own narrative about our character comes into play here. What's our social standing and our economic well-being? These things can be extremely detrimental to that. And then, do we do the right thing, even when it costs more than we want to pay? I think, as I'll get to later in my presentation, there are a couple of lawmakers I chose to sort of highlight, and one I'll be talking about a little bit later in a little more detail, but I'm sure is something everyone was recently impressed by, was John Lewis. And when he crossed the bridge, Pettus Bridge, I don't think he intended to be clubbed and to actually give blood. That was not something he was looking to do. He was prepared to do it, though. And so I think that's a great example of where somebody lives and acts, based on their character. And no one's born with good character. I mean, it's not a hereditary trait. It's not something that's passed on genetically. There may be certain aspects of the types of temperament and certain predispositions that might enable somebody to more comfortably handle certain aspects of that VUCA world because they do have an even temperament. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have good character in their calmness to handle it. And so it's important to understand that it's not determined by a single act or even a single act of noble act. It really is about consistency. How do you show up and operate? And consistency, while Buddhists would probably tell you, is a bit of an illusion. No one is totally consistent all the time, but we can certainly attempt to live up to the character traits that we value. And so it really is about a moral code, a moral set of values that usually we're taught. And at the end of the day, it really is about action. It's formed and revealed by how one deals with everyday situations, as well as those pressurized situations that certainly those of us in leadership positions have to contend with. We don't really know how early it develops, but I would argue that just as we come to terms with the fact that we have certain things we identify as, whether it be gender or race or family size and how that affects what we do. Certainly character is something that gets infused. I think a lot of folks would probably identify with the term home training. I certainly have to thank the lady in the other room and here, because she actually felt like the hard way at times the way she went about it with my brother and I. But bottom line was, she had very high standards for us as it related to dealing with people and as it related to giving back. And so I think it gets really infused. You get impressed and imprinted with it at a very early age. But it's built decision by decision. We have a choice when we get up in the morning. We can go one direction or we can go in another direction, and we may sometimes find ourselves spinning because we're not sure which direction to go in. But at some point you make a call and you move out on things. And, it's not as simple as necessarily good versus evil, but many times in life, it's a bright choice. And it depends on how your character is developed. The way we treat people, we think cannot help or hurt us, tells us a lot about our character. And if you are pretty consistent, whether the person can have a profound impact on you and your career or not. That's a pretty good indicator. So this is some work by the Joseph and Edna Josephson Institute of Ethics. And they talk about these 6 pillars of character. Now, I mean, when you look at the literature and character, there'll be a lot of commonality, but there'll also be some differences. And I just happened to pick this one because it sort of lays out some pretty basic things for us to maybe hone in on and focus on and think about as we're gauging our particular brand or version of character. So the 6 pillars are trustworthiness, respect, responsibility, fairness, caring, and citizenship. Your character is a set of beliefs and attitudes that define what sort of person you are. That behavior is observable, and people will consistently perform consistent with that character. For your pleasure, I simply spell it out here. Trustworthiness, have the character to do the right thing. Had to take a page out of Aretha Franklin with the second one, respect, just a little bit. Responsibility, being accountable for your words and actions. One of the most important things I've found in leadership is walking the talk. People talk a good game, but when the going gets tough, sometimes they're backing up like crabs. And if you're going to be following them, you want to make sure that they're going to continue to be in the fight with you when it gets tough. Fairness, playing by the rules and treating people fairly. That's something we're looking at from a societal standpoint in a major way. And some of the civil unrest we're dealing with right now is indicative of a lack of it. And, the elephant in the room probably this morning with the Democratic convention going on, and I'm not clairvoyant, so when I set out to put together this presentation, I was not in any way channeling the comments of our former First Lady, but she made the comment about our nation underperforming as it related to matters of character. And I thought, wow, how timely that I was going to have this opportunity to chat with you today. So this particular slide, obviously begs the question, why is it so important that we have character and or good character? And these things are pretty obvious, I think, to most of you. It provides that link of trust between you as a leader and the people who are signing on to follow you. And I guess there's that quote, if you are leading and you look around and nobody's behind you, you're just taking a walk. And people are only going to follow you as far as they can trust you. If they have to, because they're in a position that you hold power over, they may follow you to a point, but it's almost impossible to do our public service jobs in 2020 without getting at least a little bit of discretionary effort from our people. And I have found that when people trust you and you walk the talk with them, you support them, you push praise down and any complaints you pull up to yourself and take responsibility for them, that they will go through a brick wall for you, or more importantly, go through a brick wall for the public, for the people we serve. And so you really have to have that trust dynamic if you're going to be an effective leader. And so, the issue of being a strong source, it becomes a source of being, having that character. The people note you as being someone of integrity, respect, and responsibility. No style of leadership is effective all the time. And so even though we may adopt certain styles that we want to believe are indicative of ourselves, if you're going to be an effective leader, you're going to have to change up and perhaps adopt sort of a toolkit of styles. I happen to subscribe to servant leadership, and I have found that is probably the general style that sits well with my value system. These are 10 traits of high character leaders. I'm not going to go into them in any great detail, but I did want to sort of put it out there as an indicator of the kinds of things you might want to think about as you evaluate yourself or those other people who you get to observe either by following them as leaders or people who are leaders under you as a leader. The way they win is often they don't feel the need to rub it in. The way they lose, they don't necessarily feel a need to berate the winner or to take it out on, if they were part of some group effort, take it out on the people who lost with them. The way they go about controlling things and the way they empower others to do their best work. All of those things are reflections of what character we bring to the table as leaders. But I want to focus on that last bullet because it's extremely important from my point of view. I sincerely believe that you cannot lead people effectively unless you love them. It's extremely important to the work that we do and love the people who help us do that work. And if we're not taking it to that degree, or if we're not making that level of connection, and I'm not talking about romantic love, obviously, I'm talking about agape love, where we value people and make sure that we let them know we value them, the work that they do. So I've always liked this quote from Abraham Lincoln, because I think it really does characterize the way in which character plays out, the way in which we wield power, and how that power is reflected in how we're perceived to be. So his quote was, "Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power." And I have experienced that many times in my own career, and I've had that conversation with many people. One of the advantages of teaching in the Key Leadership Program is that you have an opportunity to talk with many aspiring leaders and many senior executives. And what I have heard is that, and that's what triggered my wanting to have this title, because I've heard from too many to make me feel comfortable, too many people that while we do have a lot of character-driven leaders in the public service, we have a few characters who obviously aspire to be in leadership roles, but the question is, are they worthy of having those leadership roles? The best leaders have qualities rooted in good character. And these are some of the points I would make on that. They tend to be goal and people oriented. They don't try to lead alone. They recognize that they're only as good as people who are supporting them and the people who they have to work with on these kinds of things. They're open to criticism. They don't feel like they have to be right all the time. They can accept responsibility because they know they've done the right thing, or at least intended to do the right thing. And very often that will sustain them in grappling with its success or failure. They put the best interests of others before their own. That's certainly what servant leadership is all about. They want to be held accountable for the authority that they exercise. They lead by example. They keep in touch with the work being undertaken. They don't simply give directions and go sit with their feet up waiting for the results. They seek out wise advisors, and they want to be held accountable for the work that they do. So the proof of the pudding, as they say, is in the eating. And saying that you are a high caliber leader, and being recognized as acting that way are two very different things. Here we have 4 measures to think about, in addition to the other things we've talked about. Some of it's duplicative, but integrity, responsibility, forgiveness, and compassion are all qualities that high character people bring. The high character leadership sets the standards for the habits, principles, expectations, and behaviors that shape an organization's culture, drive workforce engagement, and fuel organizational dynamics. And so some of the troubled organizations that we find ourselves in very often are troubled because the agency didn't have a consistent string of high caliber people at the helm. And you can usually feel an organization what are the rules of that organization, both stated and unstated? What kinds of cultural dynamics set the tone for whether or not there's fairness, whether or not people are given an opportunity to do their work effectively without micromanagement. And being a good person is hard. I mean, we often talk about, if you're going to be your better self, it requires work. And people who are lazy about doing that work are usually going to struggle with their character. And we shouldn't assume that most people are operating at their better selves. We really do need to pay attention, not to what they're telling us, but what they're showing. So do you have to be high character from the start? No, it's obviously, it would be nice if you had good home training, as I said earlier, or good moral examples to choose from at the earliest possible ages. But who you are morally is not necessarily set in stone. People have been known to experience redemption, even if they operated in a way that wasn't necessarily high character. Maybe it was middle of the road character, but they can aspire to high character and can get there with the right attention to their character and how they treat people, their actions. So think about the worst bosses you have had during your career. What were they like? How did they make you feel? Is that experience with them burned indelibly in your brain? For me, they are. I mean, I can tell you, I'm fortunate in that most of the people I've been a direct report to have been people of, if I had to make a judgment, high character people. I've been fortunate that way. But I have had a few that whose experience is burned indelibly in my brain as not such high character people. And I would imagine most of you, if you've had that experience, you can recall it. Did they exhibit any of these toxic traits? They think they're the best at everything. Their actions don't match their words. They surround themselves with yes people. They don't take your input well. They try to control everything. They don't censor what they say. They are driven by their egos. They are overly optimistic and don't want to hear any bad news. They are totally rigid and inflexible. They lack integrity, straight up. They will not make decisions and will not take the blame. They micromanage. They're unfair, and on and on and on and on. We could probably come up with a much longer list. But think about that for a moment, and I hope as you think about those people, you don't resemble, if you're in a leadership position, any of those qualities. And if you do, then my argument to you this afternoon is you have some work to do. This is some work by Dr. Robert Hogan, Reflections on the Dark Side. And like everything, quite frankly, everything that's human, there can be a positive side to it or a negative side to it. And so this quote from Dr. Hogan is, I think, apropos. The secrets of the dark side are readily accessible because they're captured by a person's reputation. Other people can tell you about your dark side. What you do with that information is up to you. So what is your reputation? And the dark side refers to, it's really the unconscious behaviors that you're about. Most people, the internal narrative and the narrative they want you to accept from them is that they are high character, high integrity, outstanding leaders. The question is that how they're perceived by the people that they work with, either above or below or beside? What's interesting about the dark side, and whenever I say that, I tend to think of the Star Wars series. The dark side behaviors are sometimes necessary for you to be successful. Getting people's attention in an organization does require having the ability to assert yourself. But when your assertiveness drifts to the dark side, then there are problems. And so there's a bright side, according to Hogan, and a dark side. And it usually results in people rising to an occasion and being viewed as high character, capable leaders, or it can actually deep six them eventually, even if they ascend to that. And so these are some of the points. These are three features of reputation. They emerge early and are quite stable over a long period of time. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and reputation forms the basis of everything that happens in our lives. We get hired for our reputations. We may get fired because of our reputations. This particular point about, people loan us money based on our reputations. And so smart people learn how to play this to their best advantage, but occasionally it can go very south. And so this listing of dark side themes is something to keep in mind, and I offered it this afternoon for your consideration beyond this conversation we're going to have today. If you're passionate, you're going to be viewed as somebody who's down for the cause. You really are committed to what you're doing. But if you take that too far, then it may put you in a situation where you are no longer a value to the organization. You no longer lead people in an effective way because you are constantly driving them out of this overstated sense of passion. And so each one of these dark side themes is something to think about. You have to be tough, and public service is not for the faint of heart. You have to be tough to either serve or to lead in a service capacity. But being tough, you can go too far with that. Certainly, you never want to be aloof, and you never want people to not have the ability to connect to you. And so leadership, at the end of the day, is loving the people, having them love you back, and getting things done because you are committed to that work. These are just a listing of why we make a difference if we are high character people, high positive character people. It sets us apart. Your reputation will be that you're a high character person, and folks will trust you and want to be led by you. It's connected to your authenticity as a leader. People who are high character usually attract people who are excellent, and if they're high character people, they tend to be excellent and excellent in the things that they do. It allows you very often to have the moral high ground, to be tenacious and visionary. And you're usually going to influence people, much broader swaths of people than if you were a low character individual. So I wanted to focus on these two. Both were seen to be high character people. They were from two different parties. They certainly were on opposite sides of the aisle, as our political system defines it. One was considered to be a tremendous maverick. The other was considered to be the conscience of the Congress. And both are now deceased. And in the eulogizing of these two men, the thing that was fascinating is that people from both sides of the aisle came out and gave great respect to them because of their reputations. Now, politically, they were very different. They had different value systems, different points of view about specific policy issues. But it was interesting that they came together in some very, very important ways when it was perhaps most important for that to happen. And they had their tremendous differences, sometimes personal differences, that put them at odds with each other in very serious ways and significant ways. But when you are of high character, you get to influence people in such a way, and you get to work with people across the aisle in such a way that it makes a tremendous difference. And in the case of these two men, one a senator, the other a congressman, if you look back over their body of work, there was tremendous consistency in what they stood for, tremendous consistency in what they were willing to die for. And at the end of the day, they came out in a lot of the same places when it mattered. The Affordable Care Act being one great example that that put them in league with one another. This is a quote from Senator McCain. "It is your character and your character alone that will make your life happy or unhappy. That is all that really passes for destiny. And you choose it. No one else can give it to you or deny it from you. No rival can steal it from you, and no friend can give it to you. Others can encourage you to make the right choices or discourage, but you choose." Congressman Lewis, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get into trouble, necessary trouble." And what Congressman Lewis's quote speaks to, I think, in a very significant way, is that taking the long view. Having high character is not something, as I said earlier, you do as a one-shot thing, as one noble decision you make. It's basically being that consistent, moral, ethical, and legal person in the execution of your leadership duties. So I leave you with this final quote from Lao Tzu. "He who controls others may be powerful, but he who has mastered himself is mightier still." And what I'm leaving you with there is that of all of there's a strong connection, I think, between, as you saw it earlier with the slide, from Seligman and Peterson. And if you noticed, I didn't bold it, but on the right side was the work of on emotional intelligence. And to me, a lot of this boils down to self-mastery. A lot of this boils in being a high character leader. A lot of it comes down to how you conduct yourself, how you control yourself, how you relate to other people, how you choose to carry yourself, because you are always under surveillance if you are in a leadership role. And you can be a good example of leadership, or you can be a poor example of leadership. The choice is really yours. So I will conclude my remarks there. I think it's an ongoing discussion. If we are underperforming as a nation when it comes to matters of character, that's all of our responsibility. And we all have to look in the mirror and decide, are we contributing in any way to that underperformance? And if we are, or if there are others we could be influencing so that they're not contributing to that underperformance, then we have a responsibility, if we believe in this republic, to do all we can to live up to the leadership responsibilities that are entrusted to us. So I will stop my remarks there and open it up for any questions or comments.
The first one is from TJ. He's asking, many business and political leaders have shown marital infidelity, which is illegal in the military. When we look at character, how do we look at personal failings as part of overall judgment of character?
Well, TJ, I would say to you, I don't make the distinction. I think that one of my adages is that we are not. We're public servants. We're not perfect servants. There is no such thing as a perfect servant, in my opinion. If you're human, then you're probably going to fail occasionally, but you should never settle for that, in my opinion. If you consider yourself a high character individual, then and if you really are prepared to walk the talk, then walk it. Now you may stumble, you may fall, but you need to get back up. And if you have stumbled, do what you need to do to make sure you don't stumble again. All of us are going to make mistakes. Try not to make the mistake more than once, would be my advice. And if, I'm drawn back to my religious tradition and some of the scripture that says, judge not that ye shall not be judged. Well, we're humans, and it is very natural for us to judge. It's not maybe one of our finer qualities, but I do think neuroscience would argue that it's hardwired in us. That's one of our qualities is we order things and rank things. I mean, that's just a very natural thing for the human brain to do. We need to watch it. We need to control it as much as we can, because it does take us to some dark places. It takes us to that sort of dark side of the force, if you will, where we're making judgments of people and evaluating them on the basis of those things. And that's what results in caste systems and class systems and systemic racism. But we don't have to be an individual act of weakness or an individual failure, just as one act of nobility doesn't make you a high character person, one failure doesn't make you a low character person, but you do have to tally up the acts of being a high character person and the acts of being a low character person, and your net score is going to speak volumes about your reputation and who you really are, in spite of what your personal narrative might be. Sorry for the long answer, but you got me on a soapbox. You made me stand up on the soapbox.
I'm sure TJ would appreciate that. We have the next question from Bill. They ask, has the general character of people changed much over the years, and what does it drive major changes during times of crisis?
Well, that's a great question, and I've asked myself that question a lot, and I've tried to get as much from the literature about it. I will say, Bill, that I've heard a lot of people remark over the last 10 years of talking about the lack of civility. In fact, even in Howard County, Maryland, they have a whole campaign around civility for exactly that reason. I think our former president talked about an empathy deficit. That's a concern, and that, I think, sort of contributes to our former First Lady's commentary about underperforming. I do think that we have seen in recent years a trend toward greed and not necessarily treating people with levels of regard and respect. I think initiatives like, My Brother's Keeper, I think there are people who don't feel that they're their brother's keepers, that they belong to a particular tribe, quote unquote, and that's the only people they're going to care for are the people in their tribe. And that is not conducive to having the kind of republic that the ideals of this one suggest. Now we can argue as to whether, I think it is really not arguable. I think the founders, when they set those ideals up, I don't know that they necessarily included everybody in them, but certainly over time, as our republic has become more diverse and we've elevated the moral character of the culture, at least in terms of law. And so we've gotten to a place where everybody supposedly is included, but we don't always operate like that. And so, I do think there's been an erosion of certain values and certain attributes that would lend themselves to high character. There was another part of your question, Bill. I am not speaking to it, I don't think. What was the rest of that, Lamont?
Yes, Reg. How does it drive major changes during times of crisis?
Yes, thank you. The reality is, I think when we do our work on leadership, and a lot of the training on leadership suggests that when you are in a crisis situation, you revert to your natural tendencies. And if you're a low character person, but you are working on yourself, trying to get to a high character place, you may stumble and fall on that very point. You may revert back to micromanagement or, going to go-to people under the guise of, well, I got to put my best and brightest, but because of your unconscious bias, your best and brightest are certain individuals. And so you don't engage everybody in the work you're trying to do in that moment of crisis, which then in of itself can affect how people perceive you as a fair and equitable leader or not. And so I do think that the whole issue of character and how it plays out in moments of crisis is key. If you hone a high level of character when the chips are down, more often than not, you're not going to stumble. More often than not, you're going to be that anchor in the storm for people to rally around. And I think it matters.
Thank you so much, Reg. And this question is from Noah, and it really points to your slide with the moment of reflection regarding supervisors and bosses. It asks, how can one with grace point out or question a supervisor's negative or biased characteristics? They realize it should be one-on-one and not in a group. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Pointing out will make a difference, or will it create hardship for the person pointing it out?
That's an excellent question. Was it Noah? Is that who that question is from?
Yes.
Well, yeah, okay. Noah, I would encourage you, not that I'm making a commercial here, but my first Wednesday webinar presentation was on cultivating a culture of candor. And I offer in it some suggestions for how you might go about giving that kind of feedback to a supervisor or boss who needs their coattail pulled about their behavior. As I point out in it, the reality is you have to assess whether it is worth it. That's a judgment you're going to have to make as to whether it is worth it for you to be what might be the bearer of unwanted feedback or unwanted news. And there are other ways of doing it without you necessarily, making a direct contact on that. If there's someone else influential around this person who might better deliver that kind of a message, it might be worth your having a conversation with them, perhaps a very careful one, so as to not step in anything. But I actually, what I mentioned, bravery, courage earlier as those 24 character strengths that Seligman and Peterson talk about. This is where that comes in. If you are in a position to speak truth to power, and you have, and you do it the right way, you're absolutely right. It's not, you don't stand up in an all hands meeting and give that kind of feedback. But if this person is someone who you report to and you have a one-on-one on a regular basis for whatever reason, the work or a performance discussion, there may be a way of working that in so that they get the message. And so there's more than one way to get that message across, is I guess my point. But if you go back to that Wednesday webinar on cultivating a culture of candor, there were some tips in there for how to handle giving unwanted news to somebody in a superordinate position to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Reg. And this question is from Rhonda. It's more personal. They ask, we may think we have higher standards of character than we actually have. While we can check ourselves, take assessment tests, and get feedback from others, what are other tools to ensure we are what we want to project?
Well, if you are operating the way most people do, you probably have people in your life who, outside of the job, for example, who can be honest with you. And if you do, you might want to, and this is not a question that most people are going to put to their best friend or their spouse or some other trusted person, their parents, their siblings. But you might want to ask the question. You know, if you suspect that you may not be walking the talk, you might run that by a few people who are in a position to give you some honest feedback and who may be in a position to see firsthand. And they wouldn't necessarily volunteer that unless they were asked. And so ask the question. You know, look in the mirror, you know, it's about introspection in part, but it's also about talking to your personal board of directors. And if you don't have a personal board of directors, you know, mentors, people who have mentored you, people who you have mentored, colleagues. You know, sometimes they don't want to tell you that you have crossed the line, but if you ask them, they might be willing to say, well, you could have done that a little differently, or you could have handled that a little better. And so it pays to get that kind of, you know, take a scan. Or ask the people, if you are in a supervisory position and you have the right kind of relationship with your folks, if you've cultivated that culture of candor, then you may be in a position to get that direct feedback. You know, ask them, how do I handle things when I'm stressed? You know, do I come down on you guys harder than I should? Now, you may feel like you need to because they're not necessarily pulling the weight the way you want them to and the way that you think they can, but it's worth having those discussions. I mean, one of the, I think, problems we sometimes have in leadership roles is we don't ask for feedback. Now, sometimes that's because we're arrogant and don't necessarily want it, but if you want to know how you impact people, then you can cultivate relationships with people that report to you such that they will, you know, be comfortable sharing that with you.
Thank you so much, Reg. We have one final question, unless if anyone within the audience would like to share maybe a couple more. We do have about 22 minutes left here with Reg, but the question that I have next is from Lawrence. They ask, how is learned behavior different from character, or is it? And the examples they pose would be racism and prejudices.
I don't think they're necessarily different. I think that the behaviors and the actions that we demonstrate make up our character. You know, when you take the sum total of those things, they are reflective of our character. That's why character is hard to define, because at the end of the day, probably the most reliable way to gauge a person's character is by their actions. And if their actions are very different than their stated attributes, you know, how they see themselves. If they say they're fair and equitable, but they show clear favoritism to people based on race or, you know, organizational rank, or, you know, who grew up in that organization from the bottom versus someone who comes into the organization at a higher level, and so they don't feel they are truly worthy of being there. You know, that will show in the way that they relate to people, and in those behaviors, the sum total of those behaviors will be the best indicator of what their character is. I personally wouldn't define anybody who is a racist to be of good character. I don't think that is indicative of being good character. If they act on that racism with behaviors that are discriminatory, that are clearly biased, then that to me would not be. But, you know, like a lot of things, it's in the eye of the beholder. A male employee who is in a supervisory role but feels entitled to sexually harass his female staff, that's not a person of high character, in my opinion. And, you know, those actions obviously tread in areas where action probably should be taken against that person. So, yeah, I think it really does come down to what's observable. You know, what types of attributes you have attributes, but how do those attributes predispose you to certain behaviors? And when those behaviors get exhibited, you have to question the attributes. If the person is saying, I am a high character person and I'm trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, the whole, Boy Scout list of attributes, but then they discriminate against people and they don't treat people fairly, you have to question whether they really are high character people.
Great. Thank you so much, Reg. It's also from Rhonda. Rhonda asks, how do we handle leaders who lack character, aside from praying? They hold positions of power and aren't held accountable.
Yeah, prayer is always good. It can be tough. It can be tough. My personal belief is that one should not endure indefinitely low character people. And there are a lot of ways, I guess, that one can go about dealing with it. One of the most consistent themes in leadership and employee engagement is that employees kind of vote with their feet. If you are working for somebody who's a low character individual and they are constantly abusing you or others, probably the best way of dealing with it is removing yourself from that situation. But if you're determined to stay in whatever role you're in whatever part of an organization you're in, and you have a leader like that, then there are ways of bringing that to the attention of people higher in your food chain. There are ways of doing it anonymously, and there are ways of doing it formally. That's what the EEO system was created for. I recognize that there are aspects of that system that are less than perfect, I would say, or that are difficult to navigate. If you're represented by labor, that's another way of addressing it in a very formal way. I'm always troubled when I see or talk with employees who are suffering silently in these abusive situations. I think we all have a responsibility to do what's best for ourselves and best for the people around us. I've always been of the opinion that a organized group of employees can fire a bad boss faster than a bad boss can fire all of those well-organized employees. And so that's another way that that can be addressed. If a group of employees goes to the next level of leadership in a respectful and appropriate way and makes the case, I've had that happen. I've had to intervene as a chief human capital officer in dismissing an executive who was abusive, and employees came forward and exposed it. So it actually happened during my tenure at Social Security. So it can happen. It can be done.
Thank you, Reg. We have two more questions. One is from Bill. They ask, should this be a topic for learning in early elementary grades and later in high school?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, I think there are school systems that, and special programs that attempt to do that. Not nearly enough, though, Bill. I think that, some of what has transpired, again, getting back to our former First Lady's comments, if we're underperforming as it relates to questions of character in our society, in our culture, then we really do have some work to do And it probably pays to do it as early in people's development as possible. So, one of the things that's getting a lot of exposure right now because of the coronavirus is the role of school teachers in our society. And if there was ever a view that all they do is babysit, I think that's being totally dismantled in parents' minds and in the minds of those who are policymakers. And so one of the big concerns right now is that a lot of what we're losing by kids not having the exposure to good teachers is some of this kind of work. But I had just to give you a sense of how real that is. I had a grad student comment to me. He happened to be a strong supporter of our current president, and in my class, he basically said that he took a real aggressive. His philosophies were extremely aggressive. He said that, taking a page out of our current president's book, you have to be aggressive. You have to take what you want from people. And he felt, and he shared it because he said, I feel kind of persecuted in this school because, a lot of my fellow graduate students don't see it that way. To my way of thinking, I consider it a very positive thing that the majority of the grad students at AU did believe in a kinder, gentler way of relating to people. But we do have and I would go back to that quote from the Atlantic article by Peggy Ornstein. There's a lot of male toxicity. I don't want to single out, a particular gender, but we do experience a fair amount of male toxicity in our culture, and I think it needs to be toned down.
Thank you, Reg. We'll end the Q&A with a very insightful question. But before, this is from Noah, by the way. Noah said that they would like to recommend Professor you do a webinar on power because the quote from Lincoln was spot on. Again, a nod to your amazing usage of quotes. And another question is, it's not particularly professional or work related, but you did mention that your mom taught you good character. Do you think it was taught, or did you see some good character from them? For example, it was modeled.
Yeah, I think both. She was a stickler on certain certain attributes. One of the ones that comes readily to mind is if you lie, you cheat. If you cheat, you steal. And if you steal, you'll kill. Now, I don't necessarily believe that as an adult. There are a lot of people who lie who don't steal, a lot of people who steal who don't cheat, and a lot of people who cheat that don't kill. But there are probably also people who lie, cheat, and kill. And so it's important to model that. In fact, that's the other thing about our hardwiring. We learn what we learn mostly from what we model in other people. We learn good character or bad character, and particularly if we're defining character as the actions that we get to see. We get to see that, and we consider it appropriate behavior. And if you are reared by somebody who impresses upon you that the only way you'll get what you want in life is by taking it from other people, then you will perceive that as appropriate behavior. You may recognize it's not good behavior. You may recognize that, most of the world's religions don't promote that way of doing business, but or interacting with each other, interacting with people. But if you see that as a successful strategy, then you may be inclined to adopt it as a successful strategy in your life. I think a lot of it has to do with our upbringing. A lot of it has to do with the teachers who impress us as we're coming through our educational system, and a lot has to do with the leaders we elect and have and hold up as paragons of virtue, however you define virtue. And I think it has a lot to do with what we observe from others who are influential in our lives, whether they be people who we voted for or people who had power over us as bosses, or people who reared us. We are going to emulate behavior that we consider to be appropriate behavior, good or bad.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Reg. And really quick, as we tie out this session.
Can I get back to Noah? I just want to thank Noah because if that's a great suggestion. So whenever I have to do another webinar, I'll consider doing one on power.
Exactly. And just a nod to that, thank you so much again for yet another insightful and amazing session today.
Thank you, Lamont. And I want to thank everybody for investing the time in being with us today. It was my pleasure to be on this call, and I look forward to the future.